Hi, I'm Marty Otanyas. I'm an associate professor in the anthropology department at the University of Colorado, Denver. And today I have Rick talking with me. Thank you for taking the time to talk today.
Thank you.
We're going to spend about 45 minutes talking about different experiences, some of your expertise in these different areas. But I think before we dive into some of the things, it might be good to talk about some of the creative work that you're doing. And so before you go into, like, for example, the photography, and you have some music that you're in a band or two, maybe tell us, just so people know, who is Rick?
All right. Who's Rick? I guess in the grand scheme of things, one of the first things that comes to mind is I'm a musician. I feel like that really helps guide a lot of other things in life. I also consider myself a social justice advocate, and that helps guide the musician in me. That's intertwined. That's where I'm at right now, today, 2016. Just seeing myself merging the two of those together.
Excellent. And so how would people know about the music that you do? Are you in bands? And if so, what bands? And how can they?
Yeah, I'm in a few bands. I'm in a ska band, an Afrobeat band, which is kind of like it's like Nigerian funk is the style, and a couple of Latin fusion bands. The Latin fusion bands are the ones that have gotten maybe the most recognition because they've been around the longest. One of them is called Debajo del Agua. The other one is called Arte Cura, and they have this Andean style as the backbone to the music, and then we incorporate like all different types of other styles like funk, jazz, disco, reggaeton, cumbia, salsa, merengue, like a bunch of different other styles, but we keep that Andino sound as the backbone. And kind of the same thing with the ska band. That one's called Rocahueca, and we maintain ska as the backbone to the music, but then incorporate, again, funk, jazz, anything's on the table with that. And same thing with the Afrobeat band, actually. Afrobeat is a backbone, and that band is called Pink Hawks. And yeah, I guess the common theme between all three bands is that we love to experiment, and nothing's off the table. We'll throw down with any style.
Excellent.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
people find later in our discussion, we'll interweave some of the songs. I spent a year and a half in West Africa, in Nigeria.
Oh,
So the
cool.
music is totally close to my heart.
Cool,
So I
cool.
really appreciate all the work you're doing.
Cool.
So before we pressed record today,
Yeah.
you told me that recently there was a show that you did, and you found that the people that were there to sort of process some of the election results.
Yeah.
So tell me about what meaning you found people got out of that show. Why was it important to them and to you to be there?
The theme of that show was basically dance off the elections, right? Like, regardless of who won, like, let's get together and decompress and dance and listen to some funky music and just let it all out, sweat it out and just, again, decompress and maybe start to heal is a better way to put it. And the band that played was Pink Hawks. And yeah, I mentioned to you right before we hit record, like, I'd never seen an audience respond to us like that before. And again, people respond, with great enthusiasm to us. But that night, it just had a different feel to the enthusiasm. It was like a healing effect. I mean, Trump had just been elected a few days before, and that was weighing on people. And I feel like that's part of what music can do is heal, and like give you strength to carry out the struggle. And I feel like that's what they needed, that's what we needed. So for that reason, it was a beautiful night, and that's why we were talking about it.
Excellent. No, I appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of the songs. And one thing to backpedal a bit, you mentioned social justice, and I think through some of the music, there is this thread of advocacy or activism. So just so people understand the link between music and activism, is there one song or a set of lyrics that really sort of nails down this idea that there's some advocacy or activism interspersed with the music you do?
Yeah, maybe out of all the bands and all the music that I've been fortunate enough to make in the last 10 years here in Denver, if I had to come down to one song, it might be this song called Arabeton, which is a combination, it's two words merged together. It's Arabe, which Arabic, and beton, which is the end part of reggaeton. So it says reggaeton song with like this Arabic style, and we play it in Debajo del Agua, and it's a fight song. I mean, it's like a fight for social justice, and it's meant to energize. And when we perform it live, you know, it's usually one of the encores, and yeah, it's one of those songs that just makes your hair stand on end, and yeah, again, like heal, you know, like, or get courage for the fight, or whatever you may need in that song. That song kind of has the energy for that.
Eso es suave. Somos nosotros los otros, pocos no somos, somos locos, eso se ve en los ojos. Y aunque yo no te conozco, veo mi reflejo en tu rostro, por eso sé que es revolución. Somos nosotros los otros, pocos no somos, somos locos, eso se ve en los ojos. Y aunque yo no te conozco, veo mi reflejo en tu rostro, por eso sé que es revolución.
Queremos cambio, entonces que esperamos ambos. Si nos organizamos con el puño en alto, tú eres una flor creciendo en el asfalto, como tu Amaruño negro y blanco. Mujer de la milpa, hombre de lote, tú eres de maíz creciendo en el bosque. Urbano, panamío, panamericano, derecho violando, golpes del estado. Te ven como esclavo, dicen que eres libre, te tratan como rata, te meten los campines, la lucha sigue, sigue.
Zapata vive, vive.
Tu arma es tu lengua, dispara y dile.
Somos nosotros los otros, pocos no somos, somos locos, eso se ve en los ojos. Y aunque yo no te conozco, veo mi reflejo en tu rostro, por eso sé que soy revolución. Por eso sé que soy revolución. Por eso sé que soy revolución. Por eso sé que sos, por eso sé que sos, por eso sé que sos revolución.
Pancha-América presente, Mesoamérica presente, Suramérica presente, Norteamérica presente, el África presente, el Asia presente, el Medio Oriente, Pancha-América presente.
Para mi gente independiente de la mente, construyendo puentes de unidad en nuestras comunidades. Hey yo, check this out. Unidad es lo que busco, espíritu es lo que uso, corazón es lo que llevo, comunidad es mi empleo, la canción es mi ofrenda de esta día, en la célula de propaganda que nos manda de dilema a dilema. Saca la cadena, no tienes excusas, víctimas quedan parados y tu lucha es mi lucha. El tiempo pasa por el pasado, nunca veré, permanece escondida en células de nuestra gente.
Pancha-América presente.
Esto ya es suficiente, de abajo para arriba, corazón y machete, almas y voces ardientes, une las manos y mente, regrese tiro por tiro a los cuicos que lo merecen. Somos nosotros los otros, pocos no somos, somos locos, eso se ve en los ojos. Y aunque yo no te conozco, veo mi reflejo en tu rostro, por eso sé que soy revolución. Por eso sé que soy revolución. Por eso sé que soy revolución. Por eso sé que sos, por eso sé que sos, por eso sé que sos revolución. Pancha-América presente, toda mi gente presente, Mesoamérica presente, para mi gente de la mente, Suramérica presente, para mi gente independiente, Norteamérica presente, toda mi gente presente.
Somos debajo del agua, que traemos un ritmo de nuestros corazones, historias de nuestros pueblos. Escuchaste, libera tu mente. Tiro mis carabatos de vez en cuando cada año. Escribo los poemas con los versos más extraños, buscando maneras de tocar sin tocarle como cuerdas de guitarra que mi dedo pegan suavemente. Vale, vuelvo siempre. Sigo los sonidos por pasar en el presente, ¿me entiendes? Son sus vidas van a pegar dientes. No sé qué clandestino detrás de un ritmo fuerte. Somos nosotros los otros, pocos no somos, somos locos, eso se ve en los ojos. Y aunque yo no te conozco, veo mi reflejo en tu rostro, por eso sé que soy revolución. Somos nosotros los otros, pocos no somos, somos locos, eso se ve en los ojos. Y aunque yo no te conozco, veo mi reflejo en tu rostro, por eso sé que soy revolución.
Por eso sé que soy revolución. Por eso sé que soy revolución. Por eso sé que sos, por eso sé que sos, por eso sé que sos revolución.
Pancha-América presente, ¿dónde está mi gente? Conscientemente, libera tu mente. ¿Dónde está mi gente? Músicos presentes, trabajadores presentes. ¿Dónde está mi gente?
So what would be one or two of the influences on you with your music, or different kind of questions, if you had the chance to like play some vinyl right now or put on a CD, what would be one or two you'd gravitate toward?
Okay, let me answer that very easily. Charles Mingus, both as an influence, and if I could throw on some vinyl right now, it would be Charles Mingus, jazz bassist. I love Charles Mingus, just because his compositions are so dynamic, just because the bass is at the forefront of the music. He was bold, he was experimental, he was socially conscious. He was conscious of the civil rights struggle at the time and had things to say about it, and he says them in his music. So yeah, he's a huge inspiration. Both in making music and listening to music, and yeah, he's really effective.
Good. No, I appreciate that. I'll put, again, on screen some information about the artists and albums,
cool.
and maybe have a little background music if appropriate. So in addition to being a musician, you also do some creative work with photography. Mm-hmm. So do you ever merge the two? Like if I go to your shows, is there any like juxtaposition of imagery with the music?
That's starting to happen, Marty. Honestly, like for a while it was like I felt like I had these three crafts and they were all just like separate. Research, photography, and music. And now is like, all three of them have evolved a bit. Like I'm starting to see them intertwine. And so, yeah, like for instance, when we play a show at this one venue called Ophelia's, we're going to plan on having visual stuff attached to what we're doing. Just because I thought about it, it's like, when people come to our shows, yeah, a ton of people like to get down and dance, right? But then there's people just hanging out on the sidelines, and yeah, they can watch the band, but let's keep it even more interesting than that. Let's give them some eye candy. So for that reason, we're starting to incorporate visual stuff. Myself as a photographer, what happened with me was I felt like I really started in the 90s with film and was really excited about it, did a lot of experimental stuff, did a lot of protest photography. And then when I got to Denver, I decided to start a business and like do weddings and stuff like that, which, I'll be just honest, I didn't enjoy it that much. I don't enjoy weddings, and portraits are meh or whatever. But the important thing is that they taught me a lot. They taught me a lot about like the camera and like getting a good shot and composition and all that. So all that to just say that right now I feel like with all this newly learned technique and knowledge about the camera and photography, like I feel like right now all the music and the photography are about to merge, and like some really experimental stuff is about to happen.
That's great.
Yeah.
And as you know, I'm a filmmaker and I love image
Yeah.
work, so I'm really curious the direction you guys go, and
Yeah.
then if you'll be explicitly like, dealing with social justice imagery or some other kind of high-tech light show stuff, but I'm really excited to see what you guys do.
Truthfully, I could speak to that a little bit. Like in Roca Hueca, for instance, we don't have professional equipment or anything, and that's part of what we like to show is that anyone can do this. We're at a point where you have a video camera in your cell phone.
Te he prometido que te he de olvidar. Cuánto has querido, yo te supe dar. Solo y herido, así me dejas, sabiendo que mañana irás por otro. Ahora se la saben los dos. Sino que sabía quién eres. No podrás ser feliz con ningún otro, no. Pues conmigo conociste el amor. ¡Échale! olvidar. Cuánto has querido, yo te supe dar. Soy herido, así me dejas, sabiendo que mañana irás con otro a danzar. Chiquitita, llorarás, llorarás por tu capricho. Si no sé que es a mí a quien quieres, no podrás ser feliz con ningún otro, no, no, pues conmigo conociste el amor. ¡Échale solo yo! Todos conmigo, venga. Llorarás, llorarás con tu capricho. Si no sé que sabía quién quieres, no podrás ser feliz con ningún otro, no, no, pues conmigo conociste el amor. Sí, el amor, sí, el amor. Na, 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 na.
All this conversation we're having, Rick, is to get a little bit idea of where you came from and some of the influence, but also to talk about, some of the current work that you're doing. You do have some experience with working class issues. You're a supporter and have some knowledge with the labor movement, and you have some experience organizing people. So why don't we just go back a bit? How did you get involved in that kind of stuff? Like, was there one defining moment where you said, "Hey, I see some injustice," or "I'm excited about getting involved," and then take us to that kind of one moment?
Okay. Truthfully, I feel like it was my upbringing. My father was a janitor. My mother was a domestic worker. And so I had this working class upbringing, but in this middle class community, this more affluent community. I kind of always felt that, right? I felt like, my parents were paycheck to paycheck and struggling, or, just always struggling to make ends meet. And then I get to college and, start participating in protests, specifically around police brutality. But this also opened up a whole other window of labor-related politics and socialist politics and socialist analysis. And so, I started reading up on that, and certainly through the protests that I was going through and some of the newspapers and pamphlets I was picking up at the protests, but also in the classrooms. Like I had the opportunity to read the actual texts of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin and some of the socialist thinkers that we know, names we recognize. That spoke a lot to my reality, at least like as far as class and labor are concerned. It helped me understand, for instance, why my dad worked at this restaurant, but at the same time, we couldn't afford to have dinner at that restaurant because it was out of my dad's means. But it's what? And then reading, that type of socialist analysis, it's that exists. It's like that. It took away my internalized classism, if you will.
This is great because I know as a professor in the university with all my classes, the issue of class as a concept, as a movement, as a tool to understand who we are is such a toxic issue for so many people. Yeah. And I think because it conjures up some discomfort, people want to think that maybe they are in a different class than they want to be, or it's just really challenging to acknowledge that they're financially struggling and it's due to some larger issues.
Yeah, and also, truthfully, because you mentioned the labor stuff, and, I have been either a union member or union organizer, researcher. I've been within unions in one way or another. And I feel that that discussion isn't helping either, because within unions we talk about the middle class, right? We talk about the middle class, but we never talk about the upper class or the lower class. And if we're going with that whole middle, upper, and lower class thing, then let's break it down even further. Let's say that lower class is from $0 to $33,000. Middle class is $33,000 to $60,000. You know, whatever the case may be. You know, but it's just so vague. It's like middle class, like, assumes certain things, you know. To me, it, like, conjures images of, like, gated communities and, like, two jaguars in the driveway and, you know, pure breed Dobermans and trophy wife sort of thing, you know, college education. But I think the more constructive conversation to have is to talk about the working class. In distinction to, well, in this society, the capitalist ruling class. You know, the capitalist ruling class benefits from the labor produced within the working class. And the working class produces everything. And all our labor is intertwined. All our labor is connected, from the point that we take something off the shelf at Walmart all the way to the point where, you know, the natural resource was extracted in Africa, assembled in China, shipped over to the U.S., to the shelf on Walmart. Like, we need to connect those dots. We need to have those conversations.
Some of this stuff is starting to happen. There's like a new awareness, and people are starting to acknowledge some problems, especially in like this new environment with Trump. But it seems like universities maybe aren't necessarily set up to provide people with the tools to do effective discussion regarding class. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, it's not the first place that I would personally go to is a university. Truthfully, I'm a member of a socialist organization myself, and yes, I do learn a lot through my own socialist organization. I know where they're coming from because, you know, we have 10-point principles, so it's helpful to understand where they're coming from and to read the text yourself. Honestly, like, don't take anyone's word for it. Like, read the works of Karl Marx. You know, read the works of Vladimir Lenin, of Trotsky, of Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg happens to be one of my favorite writers. Yeah, it's just helpful to hear it from the horse's mouth. You know, otherwise, like, Marxism, for instance, is portrayed as, like, Stalinism. You know, it's like, okay, so Ric Urrutia, you're a Marxist, so you want, like, Stalinism, you want Maoism, huh? So you want Gestapo, you want forced labor camps, and no, that's not what I want at all.
So let's say you did have the chance to design a course to potentially reach out to undergrad students and get them to be a little more familiar and conscious of some of these things. What would be the ideal course for you, or that you wish you had when you were going through, you know, your university education?
They would involve, I mean, yeah, they would be heavily influenced by the writings of Karl Marx, just because he wrote about class so extensively and at such a critical time. I think, along with that, definitely have to look at other authors. But yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from the Marxist writers, you know, and there's a lot to question in the Marxist writers, and that's part of the spirit of Marxist reasoning, is to question everything, including Marx himself, of course. Like, he wouldn't have it any other way. But yeah, you know, when I went through college, as I mentioned before, you know, I was privy to these readings and writing, and I was able to read this stuff. But yeah, I was also able to read Adam Smith and David Ricardo and, you know, all these other economists and theorists, and that's helpful too. That's real helpful. And yeah, I mean, that's part of the spirit, is like, let's get these contradicting points and find some clarity in all of this.
I can feel in your voice that you have this fondness for Marx, which is great. So we're going to take a break now.
Sounds good.
But before we do, if I was Karl Marx sitting in the chair, what would you say to me?
I'd say thank you for the inspiration. Thank you for the inspiration to think critically. Thank you for the inspiration and just wanting liberation for humanity, and yeah, just for speaking very clearly and sincerely.
Rick, I wanted to ask you about the recent article in Westward. Why don't you tell us about it? For someone who's never seen it or read it, just tell us briefly what it's about, and then we'll talk about some of the specifics in it.
Okay. So basically, that story in the Westward tells the story of Denver nonprofits and unions coming together to put a minimum wage ordinance on the ballot for this November, ballot. They essentially, the story is this. They wanted to put a minimum wage initiative on the ballot, and so they took money from foundations, and the money from foundations came with strings attached. The strings that came attached was that these unions and nonprofits needed to do a series of focus groups and get polling data to see what minimum wage resonated the best. In other words, was it $12 in 2020? Was it $15 in 2020? Was it $15 now? Just see where public sentiment was on this. Those were the strings that came attached. And what I saw, because we were privy to some of the focus groups, and first off, I have to say I take exception to them turning to focus groups, and I'll get to that in a second. But we were privy to the focus groups, and what I saw was when people were talking about the minimum wage in the context of the rising cost of rent and just the rising cost of living in Denver, when they were talking about $15 minimum wage, it made sense. All right, but once they started talking about the economic theory, like inflation and wages across the board and who gets what, and trying to get into the details of how it would be implemented, that's when people spook themselves into a $12 minimum wage. So what I saw was essentially the legislating of the fears of focus groups and polling data by unions and nonprofits on behalf of foundations. So this wasn't a demand that came from the minimum wage earners in Colorado. This isn't a demand that came from the working class in Colorado. This is stuff it was strings attached to money given by foundations.
If I understand what you're saying, there was this idea of going for low-hanging fruit, a wage per hour that's above the minimum wage, but definitely far from any kind of living wage, especially if you understand in New York and other places, even $20 an hour sounds reasonable, but politically might not be there. So why don't you explain what would be the justification or the reasoning to settle for low-hanging fruit and choose or opt for a rate that is so low?
The reasoning is it's just the byproduct of the focus groups and the polling data. But yeah, I mean, I guess more of the reasoning is that it is a low-hanging fruit. It is possible, you could get it through the business community, relatively easier. And without doing much work within the rank and file or the wage earning class in Colorado. It's opportunistic, is essentially what I'm saying.
So how would you respond to someone who would say, it's better to have some legislation passed that upticks a bit of the salary or wage per hour than having nothing?
Then I would say I agree. But let's call this a gain for wage earners. Let's not call it a victory because it wasn't their demand. They weren't really consulted. It was a handful of unions and nonprofits that are administrating the interest of foundations.
Okay.
So anything to alleviate the suffering on the wage-earning class in Colorado, especially the minimum wage-earning class in Colorado, but let's not call this some kind of victory and the demand coming from the working class.
Okay, so there's a lot to cover here.
Yeah.
So the most important thing is, what's your background and how did the journalists identify you as a person to talk with to give a glimpse into this issue?
All right, let me speak to the journalist first. So the journalist at the time, his name is Kyle Harris, and I at the time was working for an organization called Jobs with Justice, and he was working for an organization called the Colorado Independent as a journalist. We both worked in the same building, and I knew of Kyle from like 10 years back because we were organizing a union at the nonprofit that I worked at, and I first heard his name come up because he organized a union at another nonprofit. So we got in touch like 10 years ago. So I've always known of him, and then we were in the same building together, and I knew of him as a reporter, and he knew of me as this like labor kind of guy. And so sometimes I would just vent to him, you know, just because I knew he understood my politics, you know, he understood the labor theory a little bit. So I would vent to him. And when the minimum wage stuff started happening, I would continue to vent to him, especially when the decision was made to go for $12 in the year 2020. $12 sounds low now, never mind in the year 2020. But especially when, when the demand was made, settled on 12 in 2020, then I really started venting to Kyle. And the product of that was that I had to quit my job on principle because I couldn't look people in the eye and tell them 12 was a good idea after we've been advocating 15 and winning 15 in cities, states, counties across the country. Like, I couldn't all of a sudden turn around and be like, hey, 12 in 2020, actually. So, I had to quit my job, and that's when I came out and spoke to Kyle. And originally, the story was supposed to be published in the Colorado Independent. But there was pressure from funders to the Colorado Independent. And to make a long story short on that, Kyle had to quit his job in order to finish writing the story. And so he started freelancing, and he pitched the story to a few progressive outlets. The Westward was the one that bit and ran with the story, and so it was published, the issue right before the elections. So basically it's like, whereas they tried to silence this story, and it just grew.
So earlier you talked about this mechanism of a focus group and that you had some problems with it. So number one, what is a focus group? And then what was the role in these focus groups in terms of influencing the direction with the campaign?
I vaguely knew what a focus group was before this campaign. And then kind of saw it with my own eyes throughout the course of this campaign. And it's when you take a group of people, a group of random people, you put them in the room and give them issues to talk about, And so basically what happened in these focus groups was there was a moderator and about 10 people in the room, and the moderator would ask, how do people feel about $13 in the year 2018? And people would comment and, offer their feedback. The reason I don't feel that's helpful is because, this isn't a study. We're not trying to do a study here. Who are these folks? And I guess because it just begs more questions, right? Like, who are these folks? Are they skewed in one way? To me, it just begs more questions. When we're talking about something like the minimum wage, the $15 minimum wage, you're talking about a movement that has seen tear gas, a movement that has seen sound cannons, and activists and people who have resisted this. It's been a movement. So let's talk in those terms and get these labor groups and nonprofits together and speaking to actual wage earners rather than foundations.
Okay, so there's some inequity there in terms of where the decision-making power was located, and then certain voices not necessarily being heard.
You had to pay $5,000 to sit on the executive committee of the Colorado minimum wage campaign, of that coalition. You had to pay $5,000 to sit on the executive committee of that coalition. What minimum wage earner is going to have that? You're automatically alienating people when you do stuff like that. Okay, if you wanted to sit on the steering committee, which is like one level below, that's $500. What minimum wage earner is going to sit on even the steering committee for $500? What, so you can sell out other minimum wage earners and just administer the interests of foundations?
So isn't the intent of these different bodies to represent their constituents? So are you saying there was a disconnect?
I guess so. That's part of what went off in my head, Marnie, is who gave these people mandate? Who gave these nonprofit directors mandate? Who gave these union leaders mandate to negotiate the terms of our wages? At the state level? Who gave them that authority? Who democratically elected them? Where did they get that power from? from the money of foundations.
So it's a pay-to-play or pay-to-play kind of formula. So I read the article and I was fascinated by it. And congratulations on the coverage and the incredible photographs in it.
Oh, thank you.
But tell me about, are there certain groups that were disenfranchised or not included in some of the discussion? Because there was this mentioning of maybe African Americans weren't consulted effectively.
Yeah, no, not maybe, for sure. African Americans were excluded from the focus groups. Why is that? How can you call that a valid study when they're part of the minimum wage earners in Colorado? When they're a huge part, I don't know if they're the majority, but just the fact that I could consider them possibly being the majority, like, they need to be part of the focus groups, and that didn't happen.
And do you think that was just a flaw in how the study was, or that it was like a consultation, it seemed like? There was people from the community selected, they're in a room to talk, and then the data was then to inform the decision makers.
Yeah, it just another glaring oversight. You know, I mean, I feel like these nonprofit organizations and these unions are just disconnected from the people. You know, it's like, yeah, they're not, it doesn't surprise me.
So you do use this term, which I thought was useful because I have a lot of experience in different African countries looking at labor rights and trade unionism. This term, nonprofit industrial complex, what does that mean?
To me, the nonprofit industrial complex is this, right? Like these 501c3 organizations, to be even more exact, they take money from foundations, you know, and let's start there, right? Because what exactly is a foundation? As I see it and as I've seen it being, you know, a staff within nonprofits, foundations are the hoarded wealth of rich people. You know, they're the hoarded wealth of rich people. They hoard that wealth so as to avoid taxes and to have political influence through these nonprofit organizations. And what do these nonprofit organizations teach? They teach the reform of capitalism. They teach us to negotiate the terms of our exploitation in the legislature, in City Hall. They don't teach us like a vision of a new world. You know, they don't teach us like how we can end exploitation altogether, but they teach us how we can negotiate the terms of our exploitation. So when you have a network of those 501c3 organizations really influencing public opinion and taking people and having them become active in the legislature and domesticating their struggles in the legislature, that to me is systematic, and that's why I refer to it as the nonprofit industrial complex.
No, I think it's a great term, and I have been using this language where I'm happy to work with a group that takes money from a foundation if there's absolutely no conditionalities.
Yeah.
To ensure that I can do what I want or the group does what it wants with the money, as opposed to being beholden to the interests, you know, tied to that money.
I could certainly understand that. Yeah.
So this is important.
Right at 15 minutes.
Okay, thanks. This is important because in classes, whether online classes or real-time classes, there's individuals who want to do good and they want to associate themselves with nonprofit groups. But what I'm learning is to maybe be critical and try to understand, you know, what's happening behind the scenes, or to be real frank about it, to follow the money and then to see the influence that money buys, whether it's doing social justice kind of work or even, you know, different kind of work.
Yeah, you know, my advice is, I mean, I've been in the nonprofit scene for like 15 years in one way or the other, either as a staffer or even as a photographer. And I'm glad I've had that experience. It's been very instructive. I've never taken my critical hat off. I guess if I were to give advice to someone is that, exactly, like never take off, you know, the critical lens. Never let go of those ideals. And I feel like if you encounter tension with that, to me it's been helpful to have a craft to fall back on, you know, be it photography or music that can help pay the bills or pay the bills entirely or whatever, you know, because yeah, I am coming from a working class background. I'm not a trustafarian, you know, and I'm not, you know, I don't have anything like that to fall back on. So that's the advice I would give to your students.
So for those that are maybe still a little confused, so explain the story and the issue that was in Westward as if you were talking to your grandmother.
Okay, all right. All right, 2.0. Okay, if I were to explain it to my grandmother, or just more simply. Basically, what happened in Denver is that you had a group of nonprofit organizations come together with a group of unions, and they decided to write the language and put a minimum wage increase on the ballot for people to vote on, so that they could go to the ballot and just vote for a minimum wage increase. Okay? The problem with that is that they didn't speak to minimum wage earners. They didn't consult with minimum wage earners. They didn't ask them for their opinion. This wasn't a demand that came out of minimum wage earners. $12 in 2020 is what was legislated, and that demand came from the strings attached to money that was given by foundations to that minimum wage coalition. So it was a product of that. It was the strings attached to the money that went into the coalition that would go into the campaign, essentially.
That was a good answer. I appreciate that.
No
So briefly, before we just take a little break, do you like the story? And if so, what do you like about it?
I love the story. I was actually just speaking to Kyle on the way here. I love the story. I love the story because it puts me completely out there. Like, I have nothing to hide, or so I feel like I have nothing to hide. Like, my ideas are out there, my actions are out there, my vices are out there. You know, I can look people in the eye and just, I often assume they know, about me and what I've struggled with, and, if they care to judge me, that can be on them, but it feels good to just put all that stuff out there and have people know it's the truth, and it's liberating.
So in some of the responses you provided, you talked about foundations. So for someone who doesn't know what a foundation is, kind of explain it, and then what's the problem with the foundations that you were familiar with this whole minimum wage issue?
Okay, I'll speak about foundations within the context of the nonprofit world, within the context of the nonprofit industrial complex, if you will. And what that is, it's a source of funding, right? Nonprofits will apply for a grant, which is money, which is a bulk of money. A nonprofit staff person will apply for a grant from a foundation, and that foundation, again, it's the wealth. To me, it conjures up images of Scrooge McDuck, swimming in that big ol' money bin, right? That's kind of, I'm being silly, but that is the essence. It's hoarded wealth. It's the hoarded wealth of rich people, and they hoard that wealth in a foundation so as to avoid certain taxes and gain that political leverage through these nonprofits. Because when you give money from a foundation in the form of a grant to a nonprofit, it comes with strings attached. Like my experience at Jobs with Justice, for instance, was that money we got from foundations came with deliverables, as they're called. You have to have X amount of members by X date. You have to have X amount of campaigns going by X date. So they determine the strategy. They determine the direction of the organization more so than any member of the organization.
So it would seem that wouldn't they be, what would be the reason some of these individuals that fund or groups that fund the foundations, why wouldn't they support $15 an hour? What's the disconnect? It would seem that would work better for everybody.
Because here, I'll speak, I'll put myself in that position, right? Say I was a millionaire with my money in a foundation. I would rather see $12 in 2020 than even have a conversation about $15 an hour. Because when you're at that level, those questions matter in that respect, right? It's going to cut into your profits. And I would rather use my influence to make sure that these nonprofits push for a $12 minimum wage in the year 2020 than even have a conversation about $15 an hour either in 2016 or the year 2020.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, it's so interesting, especially because I understand with my work in the tobacco sector that much of the foundation money is sort of a vehicle for companies to buy a reputation. It allows them to give money, they get a tax write-off, and they get to present themselves as caring about certain issues, whether social justice issues, environmental issues. So what would be the fix? What would be, for the system, I know you've sort of departed or exited from that specific kind of system, what would be the remedy for you to be happy or satisfied with the nonprofit industrial complex?
I honestly don't think there is. I truthfully, I think the nonprofit industrial complex just has to go. And I think part of what needs to happen right now is I think we need to have much more critical conversations about class and cut our dependency from these foundations. Just have organic organizations, democratic organizations that are part of social movements and democratically run by the members. And we don't need advocates who will sell us out, in the interests of foundations, or frankly, I think of them as class collaborators, when they're administrating the interests of foundations rather than taking on the demands of the working class or the wage earning class. Yeah, it's a problem, to put it nicely, yeah.
So what do you think the role of trade unions? Like, I know there's been some discussion that maybe they haven't stepped up to the plate and adequately represented the members' interests, but is there any comment you have, or like what would be a suggestion or recommendation to the labor movement in Colorado?
Okay, I'll tell you how I see labor unions now and the vision I see for labor unions. Right now, I see labor unions as being bureaucratic. I think that they take the needs of their membership and they simply negotiate the terms of the exploitation of their membership. Essentially, the union bureaucracy negotiates the terms of the exploitation of the membership with the company. So it's this like third party. The union isn't the workers. The union isn't the members. It's this third party. It's the staff. It's the president who negotiates, again, the terms of the exploitation of the membership. And that's problematic. Those are just economic issues. We're not talking about systematic change. We're not talking about a vision for a new world or anything like that, which gets me to the way I see unions. The way I see unions is I think unions should be an integral part of a democratic society. I think the way that we should think about democracy, the way I think about democracy, is that it starts in the home. With everyone being able to have a say. I think that democratic process should extend into labor unions, where we have a say. And I think ideally it extends into the workplace and into larger society. That's how I think of democracy. So it's a social justice movement. It's not, just this one economic issue around this one contract and, Section 5B of the collective bargaining agreement. It's a much broader vision. Like, unions could be the vehicle by which we transform society. Unions have been a vehicle by which we transform society. And I think to get back to that point of the social movement, I think that we need to sharpen our class analysis. I think we need to have those conversations about class again, because that's what gives us the fuel and that's what gets us to act.
Excellent. For those that are new to a discussion about a trade union, again, for grandma or grandpa, what is a trade union and how does a trade union relate to the labor movement?
Let me answer that in the grand scheme of things. In the grand scheme of things, a trade union or a union is nothing more than a group of workers. That's it. That's my answer. That's a union. As they are now in the United States, they're often seen kind of sort of like insurance companies, kind of sort of like law firms. It's this third party where this, if this union member, if this worker that pays dues encounters trouble in the workplace, they get on the phone and they reach out to the union. So there's less of that consciousness of we are the workers, we are empowered, we can handle this workplace issue on our own. They need this like third-party insurance agency / law firm of a union to advocate on their behalf.
Perfect. That was helpful. Again, some of this stuff is very elementary, but just to make sure that people get it.
Yeah.
So the idea of class analysis, what would be some of the beginning steps that would provide someone with knowledge to then cross the line and accept that it's okay, you're not going to be harmed by thinking critically about class? Like, what would be the couple steps to take? And then if someone wants to feel a sense of belongingness, are there organizations that people could turn to be involved?
Yeah, to me, it's as simple as going back to that childhood wonder. I remember when I was a kid, I had this little plastic dump truck, and I got it at Toys R Us. And I remember going to Toys R Us, And I remember taking it off the shelf, and I remember looking at the doors that led to the back room, the back stock, and seeing the seeing the trucks arrived full of toys in the back of Toys R Us. And then, who knows what happened. But now, later on in life, if I continue to connect the dots with that same childhood wonder, it's like I can speak to how that toy got to that shelf thanks to the Toys R Us worker, thanks to the truck driver, thanks to the worker who constructed the road, thanks to the worker at the dock, thanks to the sweatshop labor in China. Now I can connect all of that. And now that I've connected all of that, I'm talking about the working class. And it's as simple as that.
Excellent. No, that's great. In the work that I do, the concept that I use to get at some of these issues is the value or supply chain. So if you look at every activity along the production, from the, whether it's farm or factory to the shelf, who are the human beings involved in the labor and what is their life like? Are they getting a wage that's fair or living wage? Are they getting health care? Are there mechanisms for collective bargaining? And so that's one concept that, in addition to class analysis, can help people, put a holistic picture together of some of the issues that working people face.
And another thing that I think that class analysis does is give value to the labor. The labor that we do. We spend 40 hours of our life, at least, away at work. It's like, let's give value to. Let's put it in perspective. Do you work at McDonald's? Yes. Okay, but it's like, in reality, you're providing nutrition. Not the best nutrition, obviously, but think about it in those terms. And I guess if I could share one quick story that inspires me, I had a friend who worked at Denver International Airport, and he and his two coworkers, so there were three of them, their job was to clean out the bathrooms in the planes for United Airlines. Now, Denver International Airport is the hub for United Airlines in Denver. All right, now this is just three little workers who have to clean out the bathrooms in each plane. All right, now they were cleaning 40 planes a day. All right, but they were getting paid way too little and being rushed way too much. And so one day they were like, you know what, later, and they walked off the job. By the time they got to their car, their supervisor had already called them and offered them a raise. Okay, so I think it's important that we find instances like that and just use that, know the power that we have. Without those three little workers cleaning those bathrooms, those planes aren't taking off for United Airlines at its most important hub.
Right. No, that's a great antidote for many different reasons. People in the workplace, number one, talking to each other and recognizing the power that if they are together as opposed to alone, they can be a force to be reckoned with.
Exactly. And honestly, to their benefit, things worked out that way. But, if we're thinking long term, if we're thinking grand scheme, if we're thinking class struggle, class consciousness, let's also get the other workers on board so they support our little action and we can get, a $5 raise or whatever's just, so. Yeah, that's why I think it's important to have those conversations about class right now.
Great. So let's go back to your own family. So it seems like you became conscious and had some really rich life experiences in your own family, looking at your father and your mother and where you came from and where you are today. So take us back to maybe one recent conversation with your dad. Do you have conversations about these kinds of things with him, or does he just think you're some wingnut, out to sort of...
No. My dad is very loving, actually. Yeah, and he gets me, or he listens to me, or he just loves me, I think I'm not going to speak on his behalf, but, knowing my father, I think he's grateful that I've taken on this consciousness because it speaks to his own life, he's been the inspiration for me, embracing these ideas, and these ideas have given clarity to our reality. So I think, he understands where I'm coming from.
That's great.
Yeah. My dad, rolled up his sleeves and, is still at the same job from 40 years ago. So, yeah, he's my working class hero, my dad, and he knows that.
No, that's excellent.
yeah.
My dad comes from Ecuador. My mom's white from Chicago, and my dad arrived L.A., hated it, went to San Francisco, and he pushed a broom, learned
Yeah.
Spanish on the job, and then 30, 40 years later, he sold his own auto body business.
Nice.
And so I've seen him, struggle, and I'm very lucky to be the first, college-educated person in my family, and trying to understand these concepts, and of course, use them in the classroom to get other students excited. So one of the things I talk about in my classes is the use of social media. So again, before we recorded today and pressed the play or record button, we talked a bit about how some of the stuff in the Westward magazine, how it sort of unfolded on social media. So number one, are you on social media? And number two, was there anything interesting about this story that came up in social media that you can share with us?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I am on social media. And yes, I have commented extensively on politics and maybe more specifically on labor stuff. And after, I don't know how many years of doing so, let's say 5 or so, where I'm at with that is that I don't think it's the most effective way to have a discussion. When I post, I've realized through a few means that I get a good number of, hits and people are reading my stuff. But it's not a good place for a discussion, a democratic discussion, a very heartfelt, thoughtful, sincere discussion. Discussions on Facebook can just, no one's a stranger to this. It can go in so many directions and result in bickering. And what do you have in the end other than you're pissed off? You haven't necessarily clarified much. You haven't instructed me much or educated me much. We've just bickered. So for that reason, where I'm at right now is posting less on Facebook and writing more in a blog. Just because I do love writing, and I love writing about labor, and I love writing about, my creative ventures in music. So it's all in a blog. And also, I need to get off of Facebook because you get sucked into that whole voyeurism thing, man. I won't lie, it's another vice.
A lot of wasted time.
A lot of wasted time.
So let's talk about a blog. Again, for someone who has no idea what a blog is, what is it? And then how could they find your stuff? How can they read about some of your posts?
Yeah, a blog is just a place on the internet where you can go and you can write. And you can post pictures and you can post video, that goes along with the writing, or you could choose not to write, It's whatever you want it to be. It's whatever media you're working with. You can, put it out there through a blog. And with mine specifically, I like to talk about the 3 bands I play in. I love to talk about labor politics or just anything, really. I've enjoyed writing ever since I was in high school. So I'll write about anything.
Do you want to share the address?
Yes. My blog is ricurrutia.com. Yeah. So just my name, RICURRUTIA.com.
Great. So some people might find it overwhelming, the skills needed to start a blog. So do you have a background in computer designing, or what are the skills it takes to get a blog up?
I have a background in starting at 0 and just learning this stuff. And honestly, I think that is one of the things about blogs is that, it can carry out that chant, don't hate the media, become the media, and that's a good place to go because it is relatively easy to learn. I don't have a computer background. I have no computer training. But yeah, it's relatively easy to learn with some patience and dedication.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So we covered a lot, really helpful stuff, a lot of key terms. Are you hopeful about the future when we talk about the working class?
I'm absolutely hopeful about the future. I'm nothing but hopeful about the future. Lenin, to quote Lenin, one of the things he said was, there's decades where nothing happens, and then there's weeks where decades happen. And I think that that's still a possibility. I think we need that right now. The planet's in danger. Let's get down to brass tacks. With global warming and the people in power scratching their heads or denying it, the planet is in danger. I think that humanity can get its shit together, its stuff together, and I think that we can build the social movements and spread the consciousness that's necessary to bring about widespread systematic change.
Excellent. So maybe just to end, could I ask you to look into the camera and talk to the students that are listening, the audience members? What would you say to them in terms of one or two areas of research or projects that they could consider to maybe go deeper in some of the key issues that you think are important?
I think it's important that we connect the dots. So in my research specifically, what I've enjoyed the most and what I've found the most empowering is when you connect the dots between the profits of a corporation right down to political contributions of elected officials and organizations. You create a paper trail. You can speak to research. This is public information, and we shouldn't be afraid to use it. I think that these corporations and elected officials don't want you to touch that information, much less think critically about it. And that's what makes it all the more interesting and fun, actually, is that you can connect these dots. And they do reflect a material reality. And if they take exception to it, well, you have your paper trail.
So there's parallels with the work you and I do, and sometimes the questions I get are like this, and I'm curious how you would respond. You're taking certain risks with how you talk about things and the way you frame things. So do you ever get concerned about your health, or people, are you ever fearful because of how you are outspoken or some of the things that you hit head on? And if not, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, of course, right? Like a good old union brawl kind of thing. Yeah, sometimes. And truthfully, yeah, I'm very passionate about this work, and I have found myself in situations before where, I've self-medicate through alcohol, through weed, stuff like that. So I won't lie about that. Yeah, it is wearing work. But like any other human, I'm learn about myself. I try to better myself. And I think the greater concern would be not speaking out and like holding that in. I think that would have me in a perpetual state of depression. But being able to speak your mind, if I have to take a punch in the face or whatever at one point, or, any kind of harm, so be it. It's nothing new, and yeah, I've already accepted it, but I certainly hope that doesn't happen, or speak to the barbarism of the time. I certainly hope that doesn't happen. But yeah, I feel like not speaking to it is the greater harm.